At the same time, Rohan was again invaded from the east, and the Dunlendings, seeing their chance, came over the Isen and down from Isengard. It was soon known that Wulf was their leader. They were in great force, for they were joined by enemies of Gondor that landed in the mouths of Lifnwy and Isen. Hey everyone, Yoiston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today we will be discussing the greatest historic foes of Rohan, the Dunlendings, and their history. My good friend Royan, who helps me out on our podcast and some of our live streams, recommended this one, so this one's for you, man. There will be some related articles and videos in the description and cards which helped in making this video, and will further flesh out our story. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me today. Let's begin our tale on the Wild Men of Dunland. The history of the Dunlendings begins back with the three houses of the Edain, men that came west into Beleriand during the First Age. It is said that the ancestors of the Dunlendings shared kinship with the ancestors of the people of Haleth, but these would be middlemen, who likely did not go into Beleriand nor Numenor after. The ancestors of the Dunlendings, who shared kinship with the men of Haleth, were people who would have their own language, and as one might imagine, the language of the Dunlendings would become further different than that of the Haladin over time, just as the people themselves did, and by the time of the Dunlendings, they could speak a broken common speech alongside their own tongue. The Pre-Numenorians, as these ancestors of the men of Middle-earth were called, and the Dunlendings after them would have dark hair and features, and the Dunlendings would also be named the Gwath-Wirim, the shadowy people in Sindarin. It's perhaps even possible that the Dunlendings had Celtic inspiration in their conceptions, based on the names given by Dunlendings to different geography and places over time. Back to their history, the ancestors of the Dunlendings would dwell in the southern parts of Eriador, on both sides of the Gwathlo River, in Menhiriath, Enedwaith, likely Calanarthon, and even in the White Mountains. And of course into Dunland as well. As the ages went on and Thangorodrim was thrown down and Morgoth defeated, these people, these men of Middle-earth, would continue to live in such places, being thus called Pre-Numenorians by the Numenorians themselves. But without Beleriand, many elves also came to dwell in Eriador, and the Numenorians would, during the Second Age, begin to make permanent settlements in Middle-earth in 1200. The ancestors of the Dunlendings and their kin would come to fear and hate the Dunedain, the men of the West, and their allies, especially the Numenorians who were cruel to the men of Middle-earth. The Numenorians devastated the forests of the Pre-Numenorians, forcing them to go more inland and to more isolated and strengthened places to live, wherein they made it difficult for the Numenorians to have permanent havens, such as in Erin Vorn, a wooded cape in Eriador, in Enedwaith, and in Dunland, and likely in Calanarthon as well. Some of these Pre-Numenorians would even go to live in isolated places in the White Mountains, becoming the men of the mountains that would go on to be cursed by Isildur and become Oathbreakers. Many other related folk would be barbarous fisher folk, dwelling between the mouths of Gwathlo and Isen. Others would be the ancestors of the men of Bree in the north. And of course, some Pre-Numenorians would go on to be Dunlendings. Eventually Numenor would fall in 3319, and the faithful Numenorians came into Middle-earth, making the kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor, permanently taking lands of the Pre-Numenorians for themselves. Other Pre-Numenorians would become joined in the policies and populations of the Numenorian kingdoms, but the Dunlendings remained as isolated as they were able to, keeping some of their own lands, language, and hatred for the Dunedain and their allies. However, Gondor and its outlying fortifications would impede on the north, such as the fortresses Engrenost, Isengard, and Aglarond, the Hornburg. It's also possible that the fortifications of Arnor, likely those of Cardolan in the later days of that kingdom, as well as old Numenorian structures, also reached south into their lands of Enedwaith and perhaps even Dunland. The Dunlendings would continue to hate the men of the West and all their allies, but they also hated orcs. However, it seems they would get along at least somewhat well with the Store Hobbits during the wandering days of the Hobbits after 1050 of the Third Age, for these hobbits who dwelt near the Dunlendings developed a similar language. During the Great Plague of 1636 through 1637, these folk would suffer as all did, but less than men in Gondor or Arnor, for the Dunlendings were still isolated in the foothills of the Misty Mountains. Now, since Gondor had suffered, its population in Calanarthon did also, so Dunlendings would continue to move there over the centuries. The Lord of Isengard, a hereditary Gondorian chieftain, and his small people would eventually mix with Dunlendings. The Ring of Isengard would continue to belong to mixed men who were sympathetic to the Dunlendings and allowed them to dwell nearby, until the Dunlendings themselves took control of the fortress and slew any who did not merge with their folk. The key of Orthanc was still held by the stewards of Gondor, and the Dunlendings were seen as minor threats to that kingdom in the face of the Easterlings and Men of the South. Now in 2510, on the eastern side of Calanarthon, Gondor, only with the aid of the Eotheid, their allies from the north, won a great victory over the Easterlings. For their aid, the Eotheid and their leader Eorl would be granted Calanarthon to dwell in by Gondor, and so Calanarthon became Rohan, and its people the Rohirrim. It would not be long until the kings Brago and Aldor, son and grandson of Eorl respectively, drove the Dunlendings out of Rohan, beyond the river Isen to Enedwaith. The Dunlendings would never forget the northern barbarians, or strawheads, who stole their land, as many Dunlendings called the mostly blonde Rohirrim in derogatory fashion. But after King Eldor's death, the Dunlendings returned, settling in northwestern Rohan, or on the southern eaves of Fangorn, being openly hostile to the men of Rohan. It was curious to the Rohirrim how they did this, for the fords of Isen were guarded, and the Dunlendings had not come in from the south. King Deor of Rohan went north with some folk to find, as he thought, Isengard under siege by Dunlendings. After slaying these Dunlendings outside of the ring, and sending word to the gates of the ring, he realized the whole fortress had been taken by Dunlendings, the Gondorian guards overthrown, and Deor sent word to Agelmoth, steward of Gondor, in 2710. But the Gondorians could send no help at that time to retake their own fortification, so the Dunlendings retained control over it for some time. However, some Dunlendings had mixed with the Rohirrim. Most famous of these unions between Dunlending and Rohirrim came with the man Freka, who claimed descendancy from King Freowine, but still had much Dunlending blood in his veins. He had lands on either side of the Adorn River and a stronghold at the source of Adorn. He was an arrogant man, paying little heed or care to King Helm. In 2754, Freka came to a council of the king with many men, requesting threateningly that Helm marry his daughter to Wulf, the son of Freka, and after some insults were exchanged, Helm struck Freka, killing him instantly and earning Helm the epithet Hammerhand. Helm thus declared Wulf, son of Freka, and all of his folk enemies of Rohan, and Wulf fled with his people west. After a few years, in 2758, Wulf returned and invaded Rohan with a host of Dunlendings and other allies amongst the enemies of Gondor, who came up Isen and Lifnwy, while at that time Corsairs attacked Gondor, not allowing the men of the South Kingdom to come to the aid of Rohan. The Dunlendings from over the Isen and from Isengard were too great, and they took Edoras and Meduseld, and Wulf sat upon the throne and called himself the King of Rohan. It was that year, 2758, through part of the next year, that the long winter started as well. The true king, Helm Hammerhand, had retreated to the Hornburg with his people, and though Helm would slay many Dunlendings during their siege of Helm's Deep during the winter, the king would perish in the cold. The men of Dunland would always hate Helm afterwards, however, and fear his horn. But it was not the end for the Rohirrim, for Helm's nephew, his sister's son Frealof, would surprise Wulf and his men, for Frealof and his men had taken refuge during the long winter at Dunharrow, and in the spring he came and raided against the Dunlendings at Edoras, and he reclaimed it, killing Wulf. King Frealof drove the Dunlendings out of Rohan, across both the Isen and Adorn rivers, and he also starved those within Isengard until they surrendered and left the fortress. The Dunlendings were utterly defeated by this gambit, but would not forget it. King Frealof would recommend to Beren, the steward of Gondor at that time, that Isengard and Orthanc be given to Sauron the Wise, which indeed came to pass. Sauron would learn well of his Dunlending neighbors and their hatred for Rohan and its allies, and he would use this to his advantage when he betrayed the West and sought to destroy the Horse Lords of Rohan. Fulquine would also need help from Gondor in driving the Dunlendings out of the west march of Rohan, in between the rivers Adorn and Isen. Sometime before 3019, Sauron would recruit the Dunlendings to serve him and fight for him. One Dunlending spy of Sauron would even have to betray his master in favor of the Black Riders to survive, and this would be the squint-eyed Southerner that Frodo saw in Bree. Sauron further incited the Dunlending hatred for the Rohirrim, even spreading lies about the evil and cruelty of the Rohirrim. Remembering their ancient grievances with the Rohirrim, the Dunlendings went to war under the command of Sauron, alongside his orcs and Uruk-hai, burning Rohan and killing its people. They made up a good part of the force that besieged the Hornburg during the Battle of Helm's Deep, but when the White Rider led his charge, the wild men of Dunland fell on their faces before him. In the aftermath of the battle, Lord Erkenbrand of Westfold showed the Dunlendings mercy, though they had done much evil. The Dunlending's weapons were taken from them, and they would help repair in the evil they had done to Helm's Deep, taking oaths afterwards to never pass the Eisen in arms again, nor fight alongside the enemies of men. But they would return home, for they had been deceived by Sauron, and many of them had been slain for it, and even should they have conquered with Sauron, they likely would have received little better reward for it. Erkenbrand gave them mercy indeed. The Dunlendings were taken aback by this mercy, for one of the lies Sauron had told them was that the Rohirrim burned their prisoners. But other Dunlendings still enacted Sauron's plans in the north, in Bree and in the Shire, as well as on the ways to those places. But in the end, these men were also defeated by the heroes of the West. Beyond this, we can guess little at the final fate of the Dunlendings in the Fourth Age and beyond. I might imagine that there was still a great amount of reconciliation that needed to happen between the men of Rohan and the Dunlendings, and there would be great adjustments made to ensure the prosperity of both the Dunlendings and other men who dwelt nearby in Arnor or Rohan. But surely pacts of peace, and perhaps even alliances were made, and old vengeances forgotten. And so we come to the end of our tale about the Dunlendings of Middle-earth. From the Dunlendings, we see that, when it comes to all people, aggressors and victims are not so easily seen. The Dunlendings had lands they dwelt in taken from them without a word, but so too did they repay this with great evil upon innocence. The best way forward is through compassionate speech and open counsel. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this video on the Dunlendings of Middle-earth. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this with a friend. What are your thoughts, questions, additions, and corrections on the Dunlendings? Let me know in the comments below. They really are an interesting folk, as are all the men of Middle-earth, and I do wish we knew more about them and their culture, especially in those parts of Middle-earth. To further support the channel, please check out our music channel, Facebook, Twitter, merch, and Patreon for a podcast and Discord server. All those links are in the description below. I want to shout out our Valar tier patrons: Adrian De La Tour, Chris Ortner, Peter Shepard, Jonathan Putnam, Mark Kralik, Blair Scouten, Tobias Goldner, Ryan Ramsey, Adam Rink, Merton, John Hume, Tom Bombadil, Ridgie93, Chip Slade, and our newest Valar tier patron, Jennifer Wood. And thank you to all of my patrons. Finally, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the Free Peoples today. And I'll see you all again next week with a video on the 3 kinslangs of the First Age and what they were. Everyone, thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one, my great friends.